Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome to you all. I'm Charlotte Christensen, a Senior Collection Description Specialist at Te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa, National Library of New Zealand. I'm also a member of ORDAC, the Oceania Region RDA Committee, and the current Oceania representative to the RDA Steering Committee. With us again in the background late in his evening is James Henley of ALA Publishing, who's managing the registrations for this series and also facilitating our Zoom webinar access. We're very grateful for his assistance and support. This is the third and last of ORDAC's series of introductory sessions, preparing descriptive practitioners for engaging with the official RDA standard by exploring concepts from the RDA Guidance. Today's session is an extension from the previous two sessions, and I'm going to assume some familiarity with the concepts covered in those. You can find those recordings on the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel. As you can see from the agenda, there's a lot of heavy content here, but as with previous sessions, I'm making no attempt to delve deeply into any of them. This is more of a pointer to some key aspects that are worth knowing, and you can then find other sources to deepen your understanding, beginning with reading the relevant guidance chapters themselves. We do, however, need to just briefly go back to fictitious characters before we get into today's fun, so I'll start there. In my desire to simplify the concepts involved here, I've unfortunately glossed over part of the explanation that might have left some people confused by an apparent contradiction, so let's see if I can fix this and still keep it simple. What I said in session 2 was that Bluey can't be an agent because fictitious characters don't meet the definition. That is true. I also said that you can record Bluey as a value of the work element related entity of work. This is also true. Bluey represents an entity that isn't an RDA entity. In other words, one of this list. Bluey isn't a work, isn't a place, isn't a time span, and so on. So far, this is exactly what I said last week. But there is a better way of thinking of this when it comes to relating Bluey to an entry in a vocabulary encoding scheme such as a name authority file. While we know Bluey doesn't exist and therefore belongs outside the scope of RDA, where you see Bluey in a statement of responsibility, you will know that Bluey, the fictitious character, isn't really the author, in spite of what the text says. Instead, this represents a pseudonym for a person or groups of persons who are agents. If we dip our toes back into the nomen pool for a moment, we can say that those 5 letters put together might represent 2 different things. One being a cartoon dog, the other being an agent using that name. So, if the word Bluey represents the subject of a work, it's most useful to think about the cartoon dog. While if Bluey represents the creator of a work, it's most useful to think about the pseudonym for an agent. Now, there's nothing wrong with holding to exactly what I said in session 2. You can treat Bluey as that cartoon dog when you record your value. You can think of it as a value of related entity of work. That's the simplest understanding, and it works just fine because we all do know that Bluey is a cartoon dog. It's just, I didn't go on to say that you can equally understand the value in the statement of responsibility situation to be a pseudonym just like Diamond Field. The only difference being, we don't know the identity of the agent or agents involved. We don't have to. But this understanding then helps us make the bridge between this structured description and including in the Library of Congress name authority file or similar vocabulary encoding schemes. Now, for some of you, this will be a reassurance of what you probably already understood. For others, you may have wished that I hadn't bothered with this because I've now just confused you. And if that's you, then please be reassured what you learned in session 2 will be enough. I just wanted to clarify for those who wanted more information. Right, having definitely finished with fictitious characters now, let's move on to the actual content of today's session. We begin with entity boundaries, the concept of deciding when you have a new instance of an entity. Every entity has guidance on this, which you need to read when thinking about a given entity. And while the terminology is quite formal, it's a very familiar concept. Romeo and Juliet, the play by William Shakespeare, is a work. Romeo and Juliet, the 1996 film by Baz Luhrmann and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, is a work. Romeo and Juliet, the 2014 film by Don Roy King and starring Orlando Bloom, is a work. We would not consider these to be all the same work, even though we can see the connections between them. Similarly, Cambridge in the county of Cambridgeshire in England is a place. Cambridge, a local government area in Perth, Western Australia, is a place. Cambridge is also the name of 25 places in the United States, 2 each in Canada and South Africa and 1 in New Zealand, and we would not consider any of these places to be the same place as another, even though the name may look the same, and there is likely a connection between them in terms of why they got that name. So we understand the idea of entity boundaries, the idea that we often need to distinguish between 2 instances of the same entity and make it clear that they are distinct and different, even if on the face of it, they seem to be the same. Of course, these boundaries all have some flexibility to them. Different collecting institutions will have different views on where the boundaries actually lie. So just like the element pages we discussed back in session 1, you have options rather than explicit directions, and you need to decide which to apply and which to ignore for your context. On to diachronic works, which happen to be an area where entity boundaries are an important factor. What are the entity boundaries for a diachronic work? How much does a magazine have to change before it needs a new description? That's the same question, just worded differently. But right, diachronic works. By definition in the official RDA, it's a work that is planned to be embodied over time, and it's contrasted with a static work. So here we have a nice simple distinction. If what you're describing is complete, came out all at once, and it's done, then it's a static work. If it's incomplete or was released over a period of time, then it's diachronic. What you might have missed is that little word plan. By the time we receive something to describe, the publication may be complete, yet it was originally put out over several months or years. It's complete in my hand, but the plan was for it to be produced over time, so it is still diachronic. In this way, something like a fact sheet series with an expected limited number of manifestations, or what you might call a multi-part work, can still be considered diachronic even when it's finished. Similarly, issue 1 of a magazine that never produces an issue 2 because the publisher went out of business is still a diachronic work because the plan was for it to continue. At the time issue 1 went out, there should have been an issue 2 somewhere in its future. The fact that it never eventuated doesn't change the existence of the plan. Official RDA tells us about extension plans. In other words, the intended method for extending the content of a work. These get broken into 3 parts: requirement, mode, and termination. Requirement is whether there is a plan for this work to continue. If there is, you have a diachronic work. If there isn't, you either have a static work and you really don't need to know anything else about diachronic works for your situation, or you have a diachronic work that's finished. Moving on to extension mode, there are 2 possibilities. You can have an integration plan, which will replace the content, or you can have a succession plan, which will add to the content. A website usually has an integration plan. They don't publish a new website or even a new page every time they want to update content. They simply release a new version of the page. Quite often this happens without any clear indication that it even has changed. A daily newspaper has a succession plan. Every day there is a whole new issue. They don't try to pull pages out of the previous day's paper and get you to replace them with the new content. They just produce an entirely new issue that you can sit alongside the previous one. Whether you retain the previous day's paper in an archival storage facility or use it to light your fire in winter doesn't change the plan. The final consideration for extension plans is termination, and this can be determinate or indeterminate. Where it's determinate, there is a plan for how long this will continue. Perhaps it's a series of reports from a committee, and their work will end by a given date, so there must be an end to the series. This is contrasted with that daily newspaper or the website from the previous examples. Those might theoretically continue forever. We don't know when they will cease, and we don't need to know. If you currently describe diachronic works, then it's likely these concepts are familiar, even if the terminology has shifted a little bit. The fact that serials can be integrating or successive, short-lived or ongoing, is nothing new, but perhaps this breakdown of those states into explicitly named alternatives is a different view on a familiar structure. The extension plan, however, is not all that official RDA has to say about diachronic works. Separate from the extension plan, which defines a work as diachronic, official RDA wants to direct our thinking about boundaries between one diachronic work and another. It calls this transformation boundaries and talks about changes in the plan, but at this point the plan is much broader than just the extension requirement, mode and termination. Changes in content, in the genre or target audience, can be an indication of a change in the overall diachronic work plan, just as much as whether it was planned to end after 6 issues and now they're going to carry on. If you're describing diachronic works, this is a section you need to read carefully and thoughtfully. But the key point official RDA wants to make is that diachronic works are restricted by what it calls a WEM lock. So what is that? WEM stands for work, expression, and manifestation. And the idea of the lock is that each diachronic work is realized by one and only one expression and embodied by one and only one manifestation. Now, this is not the case with static works. When Tim Winton's novel Cloud Street is translated into Das Haus an der Cloud Street in German, we say it's the same work, just a different expression. But for a diachronic work, official RDA says this is not possible, that the content is so tied to the resource in a diachronic work that changes mean you have a different diachronic work. Consider a newspaper publisher. Every day they print a physical edition of their newspaper. During the day, they keep up with events on their website. Some of the content from the print version is replicated on the website. Some of the content from the website will make it into tomorrow's print version, but they're not the same. Official RDA is taking the unusual step of being forceful here and saying that there's really no point in worrying about if they might be the same, because as soon as you've changed a work, expression, or manifestation element value, you have a new diachronic work. As a result, this might affect how many metadata description sets you have, or it might not. Many institutions would already have separate descriptions for the physical and online versions of a newspaper, and so the end result's the same. The only difference is the reasoning of why it's being done that way. Aggregates are another mostly familiar area. Original RDA talked a lot about compilations, but that's no longer the preferred term in official RDA. Instead, the term aggregates is emphasised. Take a look at this definition here. See how it's focused on the manifestation. An aggregate is a manifestation, it says. Now, it then goes on to talk about aggregating and aggregated expressions, but just for the moment, pause on that manifestation. What we're talking about here is one manifestation that you're describing, a manifestation that is made up of more than one expression. When what you are describing brings together multiple other things, then you have an aggregate. The terminology has changed, the concept hasn't. We describe aggregates all the time. Sometimes we think it's important to say so. Think of a CD album of the top hit songs by a given artist. Each song came out individually over a range of years. They can be described on their own, but for the purposes of your collection item, it's often more useful to have a description that encompasses all of them together in relation to the compact disc they're carried by. And while you're at it, your description would usually give some kind of access to the titles so that users know which songs are included. Other times, we might not see the value of even mentioning the aggregate nature of a resource in our description. Think of a classic novel with a new introduction by the actress who happened to play the lead role during a recent film version. The purpose of our institution and the people who are using our descriptions will often dictate how important it is to mention that introduction and who wrote it. But regardless of whether we include the presence of that introduction in our description or not, we understand that there is content here that was not present in other manifestations of this work we might also hold in our collections. Both the book and the CD here are aggregates, and we make descriptive choices about that when we describe them. So, with the mental picture firmly in place of what the manifestation looks like, let's get on to that more complicated bit of the definition. And at this stage, going to the LRM diagram will help us. The manifestation we've just been talking about is at the bottom of this image. On the left, we have the representation of the content, the separate works and expressions that have been pulled together to be included in our aggregate manifestation. These are the songs on that album, or the novel and the introduction that we've just been considering. On the right of the diagram, we see something different, something separate. These are the work and expression that were part of the intellectual conception and realization of the aggregate. The individual works and expressions on the left were fine as they were. They could have been described as they were. It was the fact that someone had a plan to bring them together that led to the creation of the aggregate manifestation. So, just as with diachronic works, aggregates have a plan. Now, there are different types of aggregate, which are talked about in the official RDA guidance, but the differences relate to the content on the left of the diagram. What's on the right does not change. Official RDA distinguishes the left and the right works and expressions, at least in English, by the suffix. The aggregating expression and work are the work and expression that cover the plan, while the aggregated expressions and works are the ones that got pulled together by that plan for inclusion. How much detail about each of the involved works and expressions on either side of the diagram gets included in your description comes down to what you're trying to convey to the people who will use that description. Once again, things haven't necessarily changed in terms of what you want to record, so much as providing a different understanding of why we might want to record those data values. Knowing why gives you a basis for making decisions as to whether to do more or less for a given example in your hand. It opens up the possibilities for a grounded discussion of your current practice, rather than an arbitrary set of instructions to follow which might not actually fit the situation. As with all of these areas, the level to which you describe an aggregate is not dictated by official RDA. That is still a matter for your application profile, your policies, your community. Where the modelling helps is to identify when we have an aggregate, and then we can make decisions what to say about that. So far, we've looked at quite a lot of things that sounded new but really weren't. Now we're going to look at one that is actually new. The idea behind representative expressions is that sometimes it's useful to have a baseline from which to gauge other expressions that might belong to the same work. Regardless of how many times it's translated, A Shakespearean play is always known to have been written in English, and English is the language that represents the work. Huckelbell's canon in D is known for the key it was written in. It can be transposed and played in a different key, but it is known for D major, and that key is representative when one is thinking of this work. Representative expression isn't necessarily important for every work. Many works are expressed and manifested only once, so there's nothing to be compared. Even with works that are translated, it isn't always important to record details about the representative expression. There is no requirement to record representative expression elements. This is a decision that descriptive communities will make if it has value to them. It simply provides the possibility to contrast a given expression with another which is representative of that work for a given community. Implementation scenarios are a final area of the RDA guidance which we've not yet touched upon. As we've already covered, RDA does not dictate which system you use to encode your descriptive statements and metadata description sets. It does, however, acknowledge that the type of system you use will have an impact on how you implement official RDA. For that reason, there's a guidance page outlining 4 possibilities. Scenario A is probably the least likely, that you're coming to RDA from an entirely linked open data situation and you're ready to use official RDA in that context. It's been the dream of some systems people for years, but it's more of an ambition than a reality for most. This would look something like Deborah and Richard Fritz's RIMP software, if you're familiar with that. Scenario B is more likely for some, though it would still likely be a future aspiration because it requires that you have a set of structured data tables and columns that correspond directly to entities and elements taken from the RDA registry. Even if you're currently working in a system like this, it will need some adjustment to fully reflect the differences found in official RDA. Scenario C is by far the most common situation for libraries and possibly also for some other descriptive communities. This is a structure based heavily on separating descriptions of information resources from descriptions of other entities, and importantly, where the resource entities that comprise a single information resource are recorded in a single integrated metadata description set, with the component work, expression, manifestation, and item entities not explicitly identified. A single record to represent a book, for example. And finally, scenario D, where you have a single integrated metadata description set that does not connect to other descriptions. This would be something like a card catalogue. Importantly, official RDA continues to say that it does not matter which of these scenarios reflect your current situation. Any of the 4 can be your starting point when you decide to implement official RDA, and you will still be able to interact with the standard. In fact, it points out that operational RDA metadata applications may use a mix of different implementation scenarios. Where the impact occurs is in how you interpret official RDA. If you are working in scenario A, then your system could no doubt provide you with RDA definitions and vocabulary encoding scheme lists as you work, making connections to related entities as you type. If you're in scenario C, by contrast, often you won't be able to clearly see which entity you're working with because you're incorporating values from a number of entities in the same metadata description set. It doesn't change the fact that the value still represents a given element for a given entity, but in your description, that's an implicit relationship rather than an explicit one, and all connections must be made manually. Your systems vendor might have developed a drop-down menu to select from, but this isn't automatically updated when the RDA registry is updated, and so there can be a lag. This, then, is the important takeaway when it comes to official RDA implementation. While RDA does not specify the system you use, the system you use does have an impact on what you need to consider when you want to move to official RDA. Those details are specific to you. Just because you use MARC currently does not mean that your considerations will be identical to the library down the road, because the library management software you use to interact with that MARC data may differ. Different libraries using the same library management systems may have made different choices in how they use that software, and so on. The system you use does matter in terms of what your staff need to know in order to make the change. It doesn't matter in terms of whether you can make the change to official RDA. The difference is in the detail of how you help your staff understand what official RDA looks like in your context. We'll finish off with a topic which is a little different from everything else we've covered in this series because it's not from the official RDA guidance, but it rounds off the toolkit content that falls at this higher level. The Community Resources section of the RDA Toolkit is not part of official RDA. The information here is not the responsibility of the RDA Steering Committee to maintain or update, yet it includes information you find in the original toolkit, so what is it and how did it get here? During the transition from original to official RDA, it was discovered, excuse me, that some of the content in original RDA did not fit well into the LRM model and was actually community focused rather than generally applicable. And by community, what is meant is descriptive community rather than any geographic definition. In other words, a grouping of people or institutions who choose to describe things in the same way. This particular content came from the Anglo-American community and was well used, but didn't fit the internationalized focus of official RDA, so couldn't be included in the main text. The content currently located in the Community Resources section include things like abbreviations lists, assistance with different language content, and how to construct access points for various entities, including the order of values and punctuation required, string encoding schemes, in other words. It was decided that it was important to preserve this content. It's used by a large number of institutions from Anglo-American countries and would be unnecessarily burdensome to ask communities to reconstruct it later or somewhere else, but it is not official RDA. At this point, the content is frozen, unchanged, and unchanging. That may or may not continue to be the case. It's possible that one or more communities who use this content look to update it sometime in the future. But for now, what's relevant to you is knowing it's here. So if you're seeking the instructions for creating an authorised access point for a civil court, or just wondering what the Danish initial articles are, this is where you'll find that information. The Community Resources section itself is not intended to remain merely a holding place for these older instructions, mind you. There is great interest from some communities in being able to include community-related documentation in this space, and this is already being done by the Finns in their translation of the toolkit. To this end, the Community Resources section will soon be going through a rearrangement to make it easier for communities to do this, and more information will come available as that happens. As this section develops, it will be possible to get some insight into how different communities are working with RDA and what refinements they've found useful. For now, it's a good place to look if you think something might be missing from RDA. It might have ended up in here. And so that's it. Over 3 sessions, we have touched on all of the guidance sections of official RDA. As I warned at the beginning, I have not attempted to prepare you to describe a resource. That action is dependent on the application profiles and policies that are applicable to your situation. I've given you a tour of the baseline information needed to interact with the content of RDA. Together, we've explored new terminology and discovered quite a few familiar concepts hiding behind new names. The detail I've left out is there to be explored, either by reading the guidance for yourself or by seeking papers and presentations that delve into them, because there is so much more to say than we can possibly cover in these 3 sessions. It's my hope that you now feel more comfortable with what official RDA contains, why it looks different, and the fact that a change from original RDA to official RDA need not result in significant change for how your descriptions look, even if it does mean a change in how you think about them. It should be clear at this point that before you begin implementation, you'll need at least one application profile and more than likely some policy statements. Working without these means lots of time making the same decisions over and over, and it isn't very efficient. There's no denying the work involved in writing policy statements can be a significant task requiring significant resource, and this may be something that you don't want to do. Well, that's okay. A number of institutions are committed to making this effort, including the British Library, the Library of Congress alongside PCC, and the Music Libraries Association. In our region, the National Library of New Zealand already has a number of policy statements available to view, with the total set expected before the end of the year, and this will soon be accompanied by other guidance documentation. When you choose a particular set of policy statements to view, you don't have to agree with every policy statement that group has made, but it means you have a pathway laid out for you to follow. Paths are needed because official RDA does not guide you in how to form a description that fits the needs of your institution or descriptive community. It provides the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, but it's up to you to put them together. And so, with all of those pieces of the jigsaw now scattered about you, for the final time, I'll ask for questions. Renata has asked, am I right in thinking that Mark is a implementation scenario C? Mark is an encoding system that is used by people who use scenario C, yes. While I'm waiting for people to think about what other questions they might have, I might take a moment to make a plug for the RDA Oceania mailing list. If you're not already signed up to this, it's the first place ORDAC makes announcements of anything happening with RDA of interest to our region. It's been a very quiet list for a long time now, but as we move towards institutions implementing RDA and entering the training phase, we expect things to liven up. It's also a great place to ask questions about RDA and know that there are other Oceania-based cataloguers here to help you out, whether you want to talk about official RDA or original. We're all still learning when it comes to official RDA, but we can learn together. I've also included links here to the RDA Toolkit YouTube page and the Oceania Regional Committee, the ORDAC page on the RSC website. Skulk asks, could you talk or mention more about the training? I can talk generally about training. ORDAC at this stage is still taking a very high level approach to this because we want to be representative of all the institutions in our region who are looking to implement official RDA, and so we don't want to get so narrow that we're only looking at one implementation. The National Library of New Zealand will be training staff probably in the first part of next year, and as that material is developed, it will be made public. I'm sure other institutions will be acting similarly. The Library of Congress PCC training will be made public through their website, and there'll be other materials out as well. It becomes a matter of looking at what comes available and determining what is actually useful to your context, because not all of the training that comes out will actually be relevant to you. I realise it's frustrating waiting to be able to get into the actual cataloguing. It feels like it's taking a long time, but we will get there. Give people another minute. Alyssa has asked or has said, you described situations where the representative expression recorded characteristics of original versions, for example, original language. In what other situations might you use representative expressions? I don't have a list of all of the representative expression elements in front of me. If you do a search on representative expression, you'll get up the full list. If you're working in a scenario where you have authority data, it tends to be the kind of thing that you might record in the authority rather than in the bibliographic record, although again, I don't know that there's a reason why you couldn't record it there. I'm not sure that anyone is actually doing this at this point. It's a number of expression level elements that have been made available so that you can point back at them when you want to make that comparison. I think my understanding is it's of most interest to the music community, but there are probably other communities who are also interested. I would repeat again, there have been other presentations on these topics, and a browser search or looking at the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel could be good starting places to find out more, as well as reading the guidance chapters themselves. They are a little dry, but the content can be made fun. Eb has noted that there was an interesting MAC discussion paper on representative expression that's useful for further examples, so that would be something to watch out for. And Catherine has added that there are examples on the RDA element pages relating to representative expressions. Susan asks, are there any plans to retain RDA to mark bibliographic mapping and vice versa, even after the removal of original RDA? This is similar to the questions we've had in the previous sessions, unless I'm misunderstanding your question. So there will be some mapping in terms of what we saw in the element reference box in session 1. And I believe there's some additional work that Jamie has said in previous sessions that is being done, but that it won't be exactly what you've seen with the original toolkit because of the structure of that document and the difficulty of maintaining it. And Eb's just included that link, which you should now be able to see in the Q&As. Okay, well, I'll give everyone another 30 seconds to throw something into the Q&A, otherwise you can get some of your afternoon back, or morning, depending on where you are, or evening if you're Jamie. I think we'll close it there. Thank you so much for attending. It's been a pleasure to explore this content with you, and I wish you well with your future interactions with Official RDA. Goodbye.